Chapter 13, The Bigger Idea. I cleaned out the shelf in my locker. On it, I put my copies of From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Danny's copy of Wait Till Helen Comes, and Rebecca's copy of It's Perfectly Normal, which I had only peeked at. Jenna let me have a couple of old Junie B. Jones books she had at home, and Danny got his friend Parker to donate his whole collection of Goosebumps books. When Janet gave me back the Egypt game, I would have a total of 14 books. 14 books banned by Mrs. Spencer and her friends, free to borrow for any student who wanted to read them. And that's how the banned books locker library began. I still had 4 books to go to have all the banned books. Well, more than that if you counted all the Goosebumps and Junie B. Jones books and Captain Underpants books, but all I really still needed was Harriet the Spy, Matilda, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, and a Captain Underpants book. Then I'd have at least one of everything on Mrs. Spencer's list. But Miss Spencer wasn't done. When I went to the school library after school to hide out in my usual spot until the late Bess came, Mrs. Spencer was there. Today she was wearing one of those pink matching track suits that nobody really goes running in, and she had another list of books. More? Mrs. Jones said. Her face turned the same color as her orange and white polka dot dress. Honestly, Mrs. Spencer, have you read all these books? Have you read any of them? I pretended to be interested in the magazine rack near the front desk so I could listen to them. I don't need to read them, Mrs. Spencer said. Once I took my concerns to the school board, a number of other parents brought other books to my attention. I looked up reviews of the books online and decided these books weren't appropriate for an elementary school library. You decided? Mrs. Jones said. I didn't realize you had a library and information science degree. Mrs. Spencer stood straighter. It added an inch to her height, but still not enough to come up to Mrs. Jones's level. I don't need a fancy library degree to know what's right and what's wrong for children. I see, Mrs. Jones said. Let me just get you some requests for reconsideration forms then. Oh, that won't be necessary, Mrs. Spencer said. I've already spoken to members of the school board about these books, and they agree they have no place at Shelbourne Elementary. Well, Mrs. Jones said, be that as it may, until I hear from the school board myself, these books will stay on the shelf. She handed the list back to Mrs. Spencer. I see, Mrs. Spencer said. She looked at the list for a moment, then smiled sweetly. You know, before I go, I think I'll pick out some books to check out for Trey. Mrs. Jones smiled back. Anything I can do to help? No, thanks, Mrs. Spencer said. She held up the piece of paper with the new books she wanted to ban written on it. I have a list. I knew what Mrs. Spencer was doing. So did Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Spencer was going to check out all the books on her new list so no one else could check them out until the school board told Mrs. Jones to take them off the shelf. And there was nothing Mrs. Jones could do about it. For the next 15 minutes, Mrs. Spencer went through the shelves and collected every single book on her list. I couldn't watch. But I also couldn't hide out in my favorite spot. Trey was sitting in it, drawing in his notebook. I pulled up short, as shocked as I had been when Mrs. Frankweiler had gone missing. I felt the heat rise in my face. First, Trey's mom had banned my favorite book from the library, and now Trey was sitting in my library seat. And I still hadn't forgiven him for what he did to me in 3rd grade. My fists clenched at the hem of my skirt, but I slipped away down a row of books before he could look up and see me. Mrs. Spencer finally came up to the counter with a huge armful of books, and Mrs. Jones had no choice but to check them out to her in Trey's name. Trey, it's time to go, Miss Spencer said. He collected his stuff and left my spot at last. On the way out, he glanced up and saw me watching him from behind a big potted plant. I stuck my tongue out at him, but he just chuckled. "That odious woman," Mrs. Jones said when they had gone. "This all started when she didn't like the Captain Underpants book tray checked out. She gave me an exasperated sigh, but then she seemed to get an idea." She smiled to herself and went into the office in the back, the one with all the windows, and got on the computer. While Mrs. Jones wasn't looking, I snatched the list Mrs. Spencer left on the counter and dashed out of the library. I needed it. Every time Mrs. Spencer took a book from the school library, I was going to add a book to my secret locker.